for our economy, it's essential for our competitive position in the world, and it's essential that we put these talking points down and start actually dealing with the facts as they are. And with that, Mr. President, I thank you for your patience, and I yield the floor.
The Senator from Maryland.
First, let me thank Senator Bennett for his comments as it relates to the Affordable Care Act. I appreciate very much the point that you made that what was passed by Congress and signed by President Obama was really an evolution of work that has been done and recommendations that have been made by Democratic and Republican administrations over a long period of time. And that what the Supreme Court did was uphold Congress's ability to move forward with a plan that will give every American access to affordable, quality health care. I couldn't agree with you more that we need to do work on this. We need to improve the bill. There are different things that we need to work on, and Democrats and Republicans should be working together to move forward on the health care debate. And I also appreciate the point that you raised, that the House of Representatives, I think it's the 31st time that they're acting on legislation that repeals all or part of the Affordable Care Act, but their strategy is to repeal the law, and they have nothing to move forward with. They don't have a plan. And as you point out, that if that were to become the case, and it won't, we're not going to pass it in the Senate, that parents that now have their children on their insurance policy that are 23, 24, 25-year-olds would lose that opportunity. That parents who can now get their children covered by insurance who have pre-existing conditions would lose that protection. The Patient's Bill of Rights that we've incorporated against abusive practices of private insurance companies, so that if someone goes into an emergency room with emergency conditions, they need to be reimbursed under prudent layperson standards. That could be lost. And our seniors could lose their wellness exam that's covered under Medicare. And that we're closing the coverage gap on prescription drugs. That could be lost. And let me also point out that our seniors appreciate the fact that what we did in the Affordable Care Act extends the life of Medicare for about a decade. That would be lost. And small businesses who could now will be able in 2014 to go into exchanges and not be discriminated against by paying more for their insurance than larger companies. That would be lost. And as you know, the attack on women's health care, this bill that is now law allows women to be treated equally with men as far as premiums are concerned. That would be lost. So I appreciate you taking the time on the floor to go over exactly what would happen if we were to repeal the Affordable Care Act. What we need to do, and I think the courts gave us this opportunity. They really spoke to the fact that it's up to Congress to move forward on this. It gives us a chance, Democrats and Republicans, to say, how can we make sure that our health care system is as cost-effective as possible? In the Senate Finance Committee today, we had a roundtable discussion with experts as to how we can do delivery system reforms, use way that we can manage people with serious illnesses and bring down the cost. That's what we need to do. But the Affordable Care Act itself reduced health care costs. Look at the record. We would lose all of that. We'd actually add to the deficit by repealing the Affordable Care Act. Did you know the House changed their rules so they could repeal the bill even though it adds to the deficit? So I just really wanted to first thank you for bringing this to the attention of our colleagues as to what is involved here. And I do think Democrats and Republicans need to work together. And I tell you, the one thing I hear more and more from my constituents, stop the gridlock in Washington. Stop debating the old issues. Let's move forward. Let's create jobs. Let's work together. Let's get the job done for the American people. Mr. President, I'm going to ask consent that I could proceed up to 10 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to bring attention to Tourette syndrome, a neurological disorder that affects more than 200,000 Americans in the most severe form, and as many as 3 million more who exhibit milder symptoms. Tourette syndrome, or TS, is characterized by repetitive involuntary movements and vocalizations called tics. The disorder is named for a French neurologist who, in 1885, first described the condition in an 86-year-old woman. TS occurs in people from all ethnic groups and is present in males 3 to 4 times more often than in females. The early symptoms are typically noticed first in childhood, usually when a child between the age of 3 and 9 years of age. Although TS can be a chronic condition with symptoms lasting a lifetime, most patients experience the most severe symptoms in their early teens, with some improvements occurring in the late teens and continuing into adulthood. In May, a 13-year-old boy named Jackson Guten from Parkton, Maryland, visited my office to tell me about his experiences with Tourette. Jackson first noticed symptoms 5 years ago during the summer of 2007, when on vacation with his family at the beach, his body started making strange movements that he couldn't control. First came a head jerk, then eye squinting and rolling. Later, he started emitting high-pitched squeaking sounds. As Jackson put it, I was a regular kid one moment with good grades and very few problems, and then in the next, I was rolling my eyes and making sounds like a fire alarm going off. In school, the sound was so loud that his friends would cover their ears to avoid sitting near him in class, and parents of other children began complaining about his being in their children's class. With teachers who were uneducated on TS, the symptoms continued throughout the school year. So as to avoid ridicule, Jackson began skipping school or spending more time in the nurse's office than in class. Fortunately, Jackson's parents found a physician who was able to quickly diagnose the condition as Tourette syndrome. Jackson changed schools and spent the next few years in treatment, trying various medications prescribed by his doctors. Those medicines were somewhat helpful, and Jackson tried other treatments and clinical trials at Johns Hopkins University, where he met Dr. Matthew Specht, a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry, who teaches children's exercises to help control the tics. That technique, cognitive behavioral intervention therapy, or CBIT, requires patients to use a great amount of focus, and it does not work for everyone, but it did help Jackson control his squeaks. In the middle school, he encountered a guidance counselor named Mrs. Oates, who helped change his life. In Jackson's word, she learned as much as she could about TS and helped me learn how to deal with the kids better and talk to teachers about what was happening. She also gave me a safe place to hang out when things were bad. Through her and a group that my mom started to help other families with TS in our area, I made a few friends who understood me better. She also helped Jackson develop a presentation for the 6th grade classes in his school. Jackson is now 13 years of age, and in September he will enter the 9th grade at Haverford High School. He is no longer feeling depressed, and he no longer retreats from others because of his condition. Rather, he welcomes the opportunity to use his experiences to educate teachers and other students as a youth ambassador, a position for which he was trained at the National TSA Conference with about 40 other young people. Recently, he presented information about TS to more than 400 elementary school students, and he says he really enjoys answering their questions. He believes, as I do, that it's important for people to understand that children with TS are not doing strange or disruptive things on purpose, and he just want to be treated like everyone else. Jackson still has unpredictable and sometimes painful tics, but he knows now that TS will not stop him from accomplishing everything he wants to do in life. Last year, Jackson's little brother, Davis, was also diagnosed with TS. Jackson says that having a teacher who understands the problem and knows how to help is one of the most important things in the life of a child with TS. He is preparing a special presentation for Davis's class that he will deliver when the 2012-13 school year starts. I'm very proud of this young man, and I am hopeful that the examples set by him, his guidance counselor, Mrs. Oates, and other TSA youth ambassadors are blazing a trail for those who are newly diagnosed. I am also pleased that Congress understands how important public awareness of Tourette is. In 2000, Congress created the Tourette Syndrome Public Health Education and Research Outreach Program at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The purpose of this program is to increase recognition and diagnosis of TS, reduce the stigma attached to the disorder, and increase the availability of effective treatments. The program also includes a public-private partnership, CDC, and the Tourette Syndrome Association, or TSA, that provides educational programs for physicians, allied health professionals, and school personnel, as well as those to have TS, their families, and the general public. To date, the CDC TSA outreach program has conducted more than 520 educational programs for 32,000 professionals and community members nationwide. This program is working well. In addition, the CDC has entered into a cooperative agreement with the University of Rochester and the University of South Florida to better understand the public health impact of tic disorders, including TS, where individuals and their families in the community. One of the areas being assessed in education as they're looking is the effect of TS on standardized test scores, grade retention, and the presence of individual educational programs. Significantly, they're also measuring teachers' understanding of TS, and this information will be used to inform and improve outreach programs. I urge my colleagues to support full funding of this program again this year so that we might expand awareness of TS and lead to better quality of life for people like Jackson and families across the nation who are affected by this disorder. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
President. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'd ask unanimous consent to speak up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've listened to some of my friends across the aisle talk about the vote in the House to repeal what has now come to be known as Obamacare, which is the official title is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, but I think history has now demonstrated that it is not the Affordable Care Act, it is the Unaffordable Care Act. And my colleagues suggest that the only way that we could possibly protect people from pre-existing disease exclusions under their insurance policy or make sure that young adults up to 26 years old can remain covered under their parents' coverage is to pass this $2.5 trillion monstrosity. That's just not the case. We could easily address these other issues as well as affordability if we were to take a step-by-step approach to try to make sure that the patient-physician decision-making process is preserved while making health coverage more affordable for more Americans. But unfortunately, that was not the approach taken under Obamacare. In fact, under Obamacare, there was almost no attention paid to trying to make coverage more affordable. The focus was on expanding coverage, an admirable goal, but one that ignored affordability almost entirely. And we now know that Obamacare was based, the vote in favor of and the public support, such as it is for Obamacare, was based on a litany of what has now proven to be broken promises. The promise that if you like what you have, you can keep it. We know that's not true. More and more employers are dropping their employer-provided coverage for their employees. The President himself said that a family of four would actually see their premiums reduced on average of $2,500 a year. What's happened? Premiums continue to go up roughly at the rate of 10% a year. The President said, and I heard my colleague from Maryland just say, Obamacare cut the deficit. Well, how you can spend $2.5 trillion and take half a trillion more from Medicare, an already fragile, unsustainable program, unless we fix it, and that cuts the deficit is, I think, beyond the understanding of most Americans. Certainly, it's beyond mine. So I would like to ask my colleagues this question. What we now know is that now the Supreme Court has decided the constitutionality of Obamacare. The Supreme Court has said, and under our system of government, it is the Supreme Court that is the final word on these matters. It said the only way Obamacare could be constitutional is for the individual mandate to be considered a tax. A tax. And indeed, it is a tax, a broad-based tax on the middle class. I want to know how many votes in the House, how many of our colleagues in the Senate would have voted for Obamacare if it had been called what it really is, a middle-class tax increase. A middle-class tax increase. I think it's important to have a vote in the House today, and I think it's important to have a vote here in the Senate, as Senator McConnell has proposed to do, to see whether, based on the fact that the Supreme Court has finally decided that this is a tax on the middle class, whether it would enjoy the support across the aisle that it did in 2009 and 2010. But I want to talk a moment more about taxes and indeed the challenges that face small businesses and working families across the country, and the need for the Senate to stop contributing to the class warfare rhetoric and gamesmanship that seems to encompass us 118 days now before the general election, and the importance of actually addressing taxes in a constructive manner, in a way that will hopefully get our economy growing again. To that end, it's my sincere hope that the Majority Leader will allow an open amendment process on this piece of legislation and allow it to go forward and have senators given the opportunity to offer ideas about how to improve this legislation and help small business job creation. What we do know for a fact is that unless Congress and the President act before December the 31st, 2012, American taxpayers will face the single largest tax increase in American history. Why is that? Well, because tax provisions we passed in 2001 and 2003, and then again in 2010 under President Obama, will expire at the end of this year. For example, in less than 6 months, the highest individual tax bracket will rise from 35% to just under 40%. And I think it's important for everyone to realize we're just talking about federal taxes. We're not talking about your state taxes or your local taxes. Many states, thank goodness not Texas, but many states have a state income tax, which is added to the federal tax burden. And of course, virtually everyone in the country pays some form of sales tax. So we need to think about, when we add to the tax burden of the American people, what that means in terms of their cumulative tax burden, including federal, state, and local taxes. Unless Congress acts, people in the lowest tax bracket will see a 50% tax increase. Indeed, the marriage penalty will increase, the child credit will be cut in half, and taxes on capital gains and dividends will increase. Why are lower taxes on capital gains and dividends important? Well, on capital gains is important because we want to incentivize people to make long-term investments, to create jobs. Why is a lower dividend rate important? Well, many seniors who are retired depend on dividend income from their retirement funds in order to help pay their costs of living. So the bottom line is, unless Congress and the President act before December the 31st, and I would submit that it's important to ask sooner rather than later to send a signal to the markets and job creators about what their tax burden is going to be January the 1st, that unless we act, every taxpayer in the country will pay higher taxes. Everyone. Unfortunately, instead of engaging in a serious manner on this issue, the President earlier this week reverted to his old playbook of class warfare and gamesmanship. And he advocated again another policy which has failed to pass the laugh test, really, if you want to think about it. The President has previously proposed the so-called Buffett rule, pointing to Warren Buffett, said if we just pass the Buffett rule and raise taxes, our problems would all be solved. You know how much revenue would be generated by the Buffett rule if Congress were to pass it? Enough revenue to run the federal government for 11 hours. 11 hours, less than a half a day. Well, I have to admit that the President's recent announcement that he wants to raise taxes on small businesses has left me scratching my head. I remember back in 2010 when President Obama said that raising taxes during a fragile economic recovery, quote, would have been a blow to our economy. That's what President Obama said in 2010. But in 2012, he seems to be singing an entirely different tune. At the time, in 2010, economic growth was roughly 3.1%. And that's when President Obama said raising taxes would be a blow to our economy. You know what the economic growth numbers are today? Our economy is growing at roughly 2% of GDP, our gross domestic product. So it's, instead of 3.1%, It's growing at an even slower rate now. Of course, as I mentioned, this tax increase that the President and the Majority Leader are proposing is on top of the Obamacare taxes. And you know, it's not just the individual mandate that I alluded to earlier that will penalize people who don't buy government-approved health care. But that is on top of approximately 20 different other tax increases that are part of the Obamacare legislation. Not only do these new taxes break the President's own pledge not to raise taxes on individuals who make less than $200,000 a year or families making less than $250,000 a year, but it also creates barriers to new investment and job creation. You know, recently I attended downstairs on the first floor a meeting with Bob Zoellick, the head of the World Bank, and the president of the Federal Reserve, the New York Federal Reserve Office. He said, a gentleman whose name escapes me right now, who's president of the Federal Reserve in New York, said, in talking to business people across the country, I asked them, what's your attitude? What's your mood? Are you going to invest or are you going to sit back on the sidelines? And he said almost universally the message is, we're done. We're done. We're not doing anything else until Washington, in other words, Congress and the President, figure this out. Who in their right mind would want to start a new business with the uncertainty as far as taxes are concerned, or the burden that are imposed upon individuals and small businesses because of Obamacare? I mentioned that in addition to what the Supreme Court found to be a tax, the individual mandate, Obamacare includes a new 3.8% surtax on capital gains, dividends, rents, and interest earned by many taxpayers. This surtax goes into effect next year in 2013. You know, another thing I've found just amazing in terms of the audacity of those who supported Obamacare in 2009 and early 2010 is a lot of the taxes that were included in the bill didn't go into effect until after this next election. Isn't that just an amazing coincidence? Well, enacting this permanent tax hike was a mistake then, and it continues to be a mistake now. It will discourage savings and investment, it will reduce productivity, and it will depress wages and the standard of living for millions of Americans. According to one nonprofit economic policy research and educational organization, a 2.9% tax increase would depress economic growth by 1.3%. You heard me a moment ago say that our economy is growing roughly at 2%, and this think tank says they estimate that a 2.9% tax increase would depress economic growth by 1.3%. And it would reduce capital formation by 3.4%. Now, those are numbers that come out of, obviously, a think tank, but what that means is fewer jobs and a lower standard of living for many Americans. The damage to job creation and economic growth would be even greater from a 3.8% investment tax. So you don't have to be an economist or a rocket scientist to figure out that higher taxes are going to depress economic activity. Indeed, it's all about incentives. If we create incentives for people to be productive, work hard, and make investments, then they will respond. If we raise the bar and make it more expensive and make it harder, they're going to do less of it. It's just that simple. Taxpayers, including small businesses, are already scheduled to get hit with the largest tax increase at the end of the year, as I've already mentioned. Well, I'll just close on this as far as this subject is concerned. We know the key to job creation is to grow the economy and allow small businesses to flourish, invest, and create jobs. That's what we're missing now. Government has grown and grown and grown. Government spent money it didn't have under the stimulus bill that was passed early in the Obama administration. You know what the projection was at that time that unemployment would be today? If we've just passed this spending bill using borrowed money, the President's administration said that unemployment would be at 5.6%, and yet it continues to persist over 8%. So we know that obviously didn't work. But I believe it's important we put in place an insurance policy against any Senate effort that would increase taxes on small businesses. For that reason, I've offered time after time a proposal that would require a supermajority to raise taxes on small businesses. The last time I raised this proposal, when we considered the 2010 budget, actually which is the last time the Senate passed the budget, that's another subject altogether, the amendment passed with the support of 82 senators, 42 Democrats, many of whom still serve in the Senate. Raising taxes on small businesses who represent the primary engine of job growth in this country is not the answer to getting our economy back on track. I know that about 400,000 small businesses in Texas that employ 4 million people especially cannot afford to pay higher taxes, particularly at this time. And we know that it is small businesses that create the vast majority of new jobs. So given that the administration has said it's committed to creating jobs, I'm left wondering why they'd want to increase taxes on those that we're depending upon to do just that. I know that millions of Americans who remain out of work are wondering just the same thing today. Finally, on a separate note, Mr. President, I want to make a brief comment about the voter identification debate. This is particularly important in my state, but it's important across the country because many states have passed common sense voter identification laws to protect the integrity of the ballot and to prevent dilution of the vote for majority and minority members and everyone across the board, and to protect against voter fraud. Yesterday, Attorney General Holder spoke in Houston, Texas, at a gathering of the NAACP. And I'm sorry to say that his remarks were completely inappropriate and misleading. Mr. Holder knows, or he should know, that the Texas law that requires a photo ID in order to cast a ballot will be issued free of charge to any voter that asks for one, free of charge. He conveniently ignores the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States, in the Indiana case, dispositively held that voter ID laws are constitutional and necessary to protect the integrity of the vote. And this is really the low point of the Attorney General's remarks. He once again defamed my state and our state legislature by equating our common sense voter ID law with a poll tax. By invoking the specter of Jim Crow racism, the Attorney General is playing the lowest form of identity politics. Mr. Holder knows better. This rhetoric is irresponsible and a disgrace to the office of the Attorney General. Shame on him. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
The senator from Florida,
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to come to the floor today. I think the good news is that I've read recently the Senate's going to spend the next couple of weeks, maybe the whole month, talking about tax policy. And I think that's very encouraging because this is one of the issues I was hoping we would deal with early when I got here last year. And I'm quite frankly surprised that it's taken a year and a half to pivot to this issue, but I'm glad we're finally on it. And I'm hopeful, I don't know if that's been determined yet, but I'm hopeful that on this legislation that's currently before the Senate, that the minority will be given an opportunity to introduce ideas. I think that's important for this place to work well. I read the history of this distinguished place, and it only works well, it only functions when both sides, their ideas are allowed to be heard. I know that we can count votes here, and from time to time we may have a chance to pass a few things, but when you're in the minority, as I am, it'll be harder for us to get some ideas passed. But I'd love to at least be able to get a vote on some of these ideas that we're hoping to push forward, and our hope is that that will happen. So let's hope that that works out. But what I wanted to talk about today a little bit is to kind of remind us of what our goal is in all these conversations. Because ultimately, I think that's important. If you can't arrive at the right solutions, if you don't know what it is, if you don't know exactly where it is you're trying to get to. Our goal, I believe, and this is a consensus now throughout this country, and I think it's actually something that unites both political parties. Our goal needs to be to grow the economy. That's our goal, to grow the economy. And what it means, when you grow the economy, good things happen for everybody. Now, how does the economy grow is the first fundamental question we have to understand. The economy grows when two things happen. Either someone starts a business or someone grows their existing business. That's what leads to economic growth. It's that simple, really. Someone starts a new business because they think they can make money at it, or someone goes into their existing business and says, I think we can make more money, let's grow this thing. That's how the economy grows. And so the issue before us here as federal policymakers has to be, what can we do? What can the federal government do to help that kind of growth? In essence, what can the federal government do to encourage people and make it easier for people to either start a business or to grow their business? And if that is our goal, then every time a measure comes before this body, tax policy, regulatory policy, what we should ask ourselves is, does this make it easier or harder for someone to start a business? Does it make it easier or harder for someone to grow an existing business? Does this measure make it easier or harder for the economy to grow? Because if we are indeed united by this goal of growing the economy, that should be the measure of anything that we take on. And it's through that lens that I want to examine some of the things we're talking about right now, because it seems to me, at least in some of the policies that I've heard proposed this week, that maybe some folks have the goal wrong. Because if you closely examine some of these policies, it sounds like the goal is, let's take a limited economy that isn't growing and let's divide it up. And primarily it sounds like, let's take this limited economy that isn't growing and let's allow us to take money from people that maybe are making a little too much, so you can give it to the government, and the government can spend it on behalf of people that maybe aren't making enough. Now, I know that may sound appealing to some folks that are in the part of those Americans that aren't making enough money, but I want you to know something. It never works. That idea never works. Here's why it never works. It actually never works because, first of all, the money doesn't get to you. When you give government money to spend, it invariably doesn't usually spend it very well. And in fact, when you give government money to spend, the people who end up getting that money are the people who can afford to hire people to come to Washington and influence how the money is spent. So sometimes the money never even gets to you if, in fact, you allow the government to do this. But it's more complicated than that, really. It can actually cost people their jobs. And here's why. How you create businesses or how you expand an existing business is pretty straightforward. Someone is in business, someone makes some money or gets a hold of some money, and they decide to take that money and invest it. They use the money they've made and they reinvest it back in their business so that the business grows, or they use the money they've made to start a brand new business. This stuff works. This is how the American economy has grown and how we became the most prosperous people on the earth. And I don't just know that it works because I read about it in a magazine. I know that it works because I lived it. As I've detailed and talked about in the past on this floor, my father was a bartender. That's what he did. He worked at hotels as a bartender. My mom was a lot of different jobs, but for a while she worked, for example, as a maid on a hotel as well. The reason why I tell you that is because the reason why my mom and dad had a job that paid them money so they could raise us and give us the chance to do all the things that me and my siblings have been able to do is because somebody made some money and they took that money and opened up this hotel. That's why my parents had a job. They didn't have a job because the President of the United States back in 1965 or 1975 gave them a job. They had a job because someone who made money took that money they had and used it to start a new business or to grow an existing business and hire them. They also had a job because other people who had money decided to use that money to go on vacation. And they came to Miami Beach or they came to Las Vegas when I lived in Las Vegas. And they spent that money at these hotels. The point is that people had money and they either invested it or spent it. And it allowed a bartender and a maid, my mother and father, to raise me and our siblings and to give us opportunity. That was true in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. It's still true. That's what you need to grow this economy. And the problem is that if you go after these people, if you go after this money that they've made and you give it to the government, maybe they'll decide not to open up that new business. Maybe they'll decide this is not the year to take that vacation. Or instead of taking the 5-day vacation, they take the 3-day vacation. And you know who gets hurt? The bartender and the maid. The people that work at these places. Because there's only, money has to go somewhere. And if you're taking it out of the hands of the people who invest it and spend it, they can't invest it, they can't spend it. And it's people that are trying to make it like my parents were, who get hurt by it. So we've got to get our goal right. Because if our goal is to grow the economy, we don't have to call trick plays. What we can do at the federal level to grow the economy is pretty straightforward. All you have to do is talk to the people who grow the economy. Go out there and talk to the people who have a great idea and are trying to start a business. They'll tell you what they're looking for. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Tax reform. What do we mean by tax reform? It's simple. We want a tax code that's stable, predictable, and affordable. Of course we have to have taxes. Government needs revenue to be able to pay for the things that we all expect from government. But it has to be a predictable system, and it has to be an affordable system. You see, if your taxes get too high, people may decide not to invest it in this country or to leave it in the bank. And that doesn't help anybody. And so the point is that we need to have a tax code that's stable, predictable, and affordable. We need regulations that are the same, stable, affordable, and predictable. Now, look, we need to have regulations, right? I mean, I want this water to be clean. I don't want that water to poison me. We don't want to walk out on the street and breathe in air that's going to hurt us. There's a role for regulation. The problem is that most federal regulations are set by bureaucrats that work for the government. And all they think about is, can this regulation maybe help? They don't think at all about what the impact of that regulation is going to be on businesses. That's not part of the equation. When they sit down and write a regulation, that's not part of the equation at all. And so you end up having these regulations that may not even help that much, but hurt a lot, that help wipe out entire industries, but whose impact on helping the environment or something else is nebulous at best. And so we've got to change that. And that's why we need to pass a law here like the REINS Act, which says that any regulation that has an economic impact beyond a certain amount of money should have to be approved by elected people who are accountable, who have to measure both the effectiveness of the regulation, but also whether it's going to cost jobs or wipe out an industry, because that's important too. Protecting our industries and our source of job creation is just as important as some of these other things that we're trying to protect through regulations. And they have to be balanced against one another, not simply made a decision in a vacuum. Along those lines, something that's both a tax and a regulation is Obamacare. Now, look, we have a health insurance problem in America. There's no denying that. But there are better ways to deal with it. And the problem is that this bill that passed has created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. For example, it says if you have more than 50 full-time employees, these are certain requirements you're going to have to meet. So imagine if you're a company with 48 or 49 employees. This may not be the year to hire the 50th. And maybe you were going to be the 50th, but now you don't get hired. Or worse, maybe you'll decide this is the year to turn all my employees into part-time employees. That's not good for the workers. And yet that's the impact this law is having, not to mention the fact that it's a tax increase. That's what the IRS does. The IRS collects taxes. And guess who you have to prove to that you have insurance? And not just any old insurance, but insurance that they deem to be acceptable, the IRS. Millions of Americans now every year will have to prove to the IRS that they have insurance or you owe the IRS money. That's a tax. And that's not going to help job creation, especially if you're a small business. I outlined this last week. Imagine a small business run by a husband and wife with 2 kids, and the business, not them, the business makes $95,000 a year. It would cost them between $4,000 to $6,000 to buy health insurance. If they don't, they will owe the IRS $2,000. Now, you tell me that's good for that business. Or imagine if you're thinking about going into business and you realize that this is what's going to happen to you. You decide not to go into business. That's not good for growth. That's why this law needs to be repealed, and it needs to be replaced. Something else we need is, how about a pro-American energy policy? Do people realize that the American innovator has come up with this technology over the last 5 years that now has made us a very energy-rich country? I don't know if people fully understand how energy-rich America is. You want a small glimpse of what it can mean to our future? Go to North Dakota. That's having a jobs boom. They can't find enough people to work there because energy is important. We need to start behaving like an energy-rich country with a true all-of-the-above strategy, where the energies we choose, by the way, are decided by the marketplace, not by a politician. When politicians decide which energy source to get, you know who wins? The people with the best lobbyists, the people with the best lobby, the people with the most political influence. That's how you get a Solyndra-type situation, where a company that was going to go bankrupt gets all this money of your tax dollars. Meanwhile, America is sitting on over 100 and some odd years of natural gas at our disposal and no concise national energy policy to utilize it. Let me tell you why energy matters. Because if we can get energy costs down and stable and predictable, manufacturing will start coming back to America. That's one of the leading costs of manufacturing is energy. We're an energy-rich country. Some of those factories that close, we can actually get them to come back here. Imagine what that would do for economic growth. Not to mention the fact that America could potentially now begin to sell overseas as well, creating yet another industry and all the things that come with it. How about free and fair trade? You know, there's this emerging middle class all over the world now. One of the great things that's happened over the last 20 years is that all over the world there are people that just a decade ago were living in poverty that now can afford to buy the stuff we invent and build. People all over the world, by the way, that can now afford to take vacations. And you know where they want to come? To the United States of America. They want to come to Florida, but they also want to go to all kinds. They want to come here. I think that's fantastic, that now that there are millions of people all over the world that can afford to visit the United States and leave their money at our hotels, at our restaurants, at our amusement parks, that creates jobs. That creates growth. Free and fair trade that allows the American people to build things that we can sell overseas to other places and lowers the cost of buying certain things here. Just last year, we ratified the free trade agreement with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. We are already seeing the economic benefits of that in South Florida. Imagine if we were able to do that with more countries in a free and fair way. It has to be fair. One last thing we could probably do to help grow this economy is deal with the long-term debt. And that's what it is. It's a long-term debt problem that hovers over all of this conversation and creates uncertainty. People are afraid, especially people with lots of money, are afraid to invest in the American economy because they look at this debt problem, they look at this political process's inability to deal with it, and they think, you know what, that country's destined for confiscatory tax rates. They're going where Europe's going. We don't want to invest in a country that's going to wind up like Europe in 5 years. That's why we have to deal with the long-term debt. The sooner the better. And to deal with the long-term debt, by the way, you have to deal with what's causing it. That's why it's so important we save Medicare. Medicare is a very important program. My mother's on Medicare. I would never support anything that hurts my mother or people like her. But people in my generation need to understand that if we want to keep Medicare the way it is for our parents, and we want Medicare to even exist when we retire, Medicare is going to have to look different for us, for 41-year-olds. We have to save Medicare. And to deal with the long-term debt, we have to deal with that. That's what's driving part of the debt. The debt's not being driven by foreign aid, which is less than 1% of our budget. The debt's not being driven by food stamp programs. The debt's not being driven by defense spending. Now, look, if money's being misspent or wasted, it's never a good idea to do that. If there are ways to save money in foreign aid, we should save it. If there are ways to save money in the food stamp program, we should save it. If there are ways to save money in the defense budgets, we should save it. But that's not what's driving our long-term debt. And to pretend that we're going to get 100% of our savings from 25 or 20% of our budget leads to the kind of catastrophic cuts that we talk about in this town, because no one wants to touch the big issues. That has to be dealt with. Now, what would happen if we did these 6 things? Let's say that tomorrow, overnight, magically, these things happen. We got real tax reform, real regulatory reform. We repealed and replaced Obamacare. We had a pro-American energy strategy. We expanded free and fair trade. And we had a plan in place that began to deal with the long-term debt in a serious and sustainable way. Let me tell you what would happen. Explosive economic growth, primarily by the creation of jobs. And you know what more jobs means? It means, number one, more taxpayers. It means you can now generate revenue for government to pay for the kinds of stuff that we all want government to do, and you don't have to raise tax rates to do that. It means you have more taxpayers who are now paying into the tax system that give you the revenue you need to bring the debt under control. Everything gets easier if the economy grows. The debt gets easier, our budgets get easier. Let me tell you what that jobs also means: more customers for your business. If someone's unemployed, it's hard for them to spend money. It's hard for them to buy a house, much less the things that go in it. It's hard for them to take vacations. More jobs means more stability for your business or for the place you work in. More jobs means more taxpayers. It means more customers for your business. And by the way, it means a more stable society, a place where people, hard work, can earn them a decent wage so they can save money for their kids' college, so they can save money for their retirement, so they can buy a home and furnish it, so they can afford to take a couple weeks vacation a year with their families. Millions of Americans can't do that anymore. Millions of Americans have done everything we've asked of them. They went to school, they graduated. They were told that if they did that, they could find a job that paid them a decent wage, and they're struggling to do that now. Now, by the way, all the strategies for growth aren't at the federal level. It's important that states take on the issue of education reform. It's important for us as parents to be honest with our kids. In the 21st century, it's going to be really hard to find a job if all you have is a high school diploma. It's just that simple. You look at the unemployment rate between people that have a college degree or a post-high school degree and those that don't. It's stunning. If you don't have more than high school education, you are going to struggle to succeed in this new century. We have to let our kids understand that. It's our jobs as parents and as a community to do that. By the way, it's important for us to work with the states, as I outlined earlier, to modernize our education system. Why have we stigmatized career education? Why can't we graduate kids from high school with both a diploma and an industry certification in a career? We need to begin to teach our kids to compete with the world, not just with other states. These are other things that have to happen as well. Ultimately, look, I think that the point I wanted to drive today is we need to remind ourselves of what the goal is here. The goal is growth. The goal is what can we do at the federal level to help grow the economy. Ultimately, the economy grows because of the private sector, because someone who has made some money takes that money and invests it by starting a new business or by growing their existing business. And we should find ways to make that easier and encourage people to do that. That has to be our goal. It doesn't require trick plays. It doesn't require some complicated new gimmick. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The American people haven't run out of good ideas. Americans haven't forgotten how to start businesses or even entire new industries. Even as I speak to you right now, I am 100% convinced that within walking distance of this building, there is someone somewhere drawing up the next great American company business plan on the back of a napkin or a scrap piece of paper. And if we gave them a chance to do it, they're going to do it. We are still the same people that we've always been. There's nothing wrong with the American people. They just need a little help from their government. And I think if we get our goals right around here, we can do a few simple but important things that allow Americans to do, once again, what we do better than any country or any people in the history of the world. And that's create prosperity and create opportunity. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President,
The senator from New York is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I get into the substance of my remarks, I heard the remarks of my colleague, or the concluding part of it, Senator Rubio, talking about ideas and education and small business growth. I hope I agree with his basic concept that America, we are still the greatest country in the world, that we encourage entrepreneurs and people with great ideas, that education means a great deal to making that happen, that no other country inspires young people, middle-aged people, even older people to start new businesses. And I hope it means he's going to vote for the proposal that's now before us. Because what this proposal does is take that young person within walking distance of Washington, D.C., who has a great idea, and once they start a business, allows them to get that business to move more quickly. And there are lots of those businesses, probably some within Washington, D.C. as well. And so I hope my colleague from Florida will vote for our Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act. The proposal will spur economic growth. It'll create nearly 1 million new jobs in this country. If my Republican colleagues cared about small business in America, they'd work with us to pass this common-sense bill immediately, instead of playing procedural games that are thinly veiled attempts to block these tax cuts that spur hiring. The bill is based on bipartisan ideas that have traditionally enjoyed Republican support, yet they are obstructing their passage. Why are our Republican colleagues changing their tune? The only explanation is that Republicans continue to block proposals that will help create jobs and spur our economic recovery for their own political gain. This is a simple proposal. It's a smart proposal. It's a tax cut proposal. In my home state of New York, small businesses from Cattaraugus to Clinton County are poised to grow and make the jump to the next level. These business owners know that the economy is slowly turning a corner, but we're not there yet to full, unthrottled growth. So they're looking for Congress to do more, not less, to spur hiring. This initiative is aimed at the small businesses that are truly the lifeblood of our nation. And we need to help them jumpstart expansion plans this year. No time to wait. There's a business in Cortland, New York, in central New York, called Precision E-Forming. It's a great small business that would use this tax cut to buy a new piece of equipment called a dip coder to help the company create high-end acoustics like hearing aids. With the dip coder, Precision E-Forming will increase yield and need to hire new employees. And there are stories like this, Madam President, throughout my state. Napoleon Engineering Services, a new ball bearing plant in Olean, hopes to hire more employees in the near future and will purchase new equipment for its growing business. Quinlan's Pharmacy and Medical Supply in Livingston County wants to add an additional location in Schuyler County. And in Staten Island, the owner of a small restaurant chain recently told me this proposal could help him expand to additional locations. Simply put, this bill makes equipment purchases and capital improvements for thousands of small businesses cheaper, and by doing that provides a real jolt to the economy. In fact, it's estimated that every $1 of tax cuts devoted to writing off the costs of a business purchases generates about $9 of GDP growth. Let me repeat that. $1 of tax cuts devoted to writing off the cost of a business purchases generates 9 times that in GDP growth. Why wouldn't we do it? Economists of every stripe will tell you that hiring incentives like the ones in this bill are the best ways to kickstart an economy and get people back to work. Why wouldn't we do it? In fact, a new nonpartisan analysis of the proposal before us has determined that it will create nearly 1 million jobs this year. Look at your state, my colleagues. 22,000 in Washington State, 10,000 in Nebraska, 11,000 in Iowa, 40,000 in Pennsylvania, 63,000 in my home state of New York, 77,000 in Texas. Huge numbers of new jobs that will be created by this proposal. Why won't our colleagues move forward on it? It's estimated that 93,000 jobs would be added to the construction industry, 61,000 new jobs added to manufacturing. The report concludes that the proposal's impact would be felt across every state and in a range of industries with significant jump in employment in construction and manufacturing. The proposal's targeted towards the mom-and-pop Main Street businesses that will benefit most from this relief. You want to talk about job creators? You want to help job creators? Well, these small business owners are real job creators, and they're the ones who make this country run. They come in early, they stay late, they work hard, and they deserve a tax break. Here lies an important contrast between what we're proposing and a different tax cut proposal that the House Republicans have passed. The House Republican proposal is neither focused on true small business, nor does it make the tax cut dependent on a company doing any hiring at all. Our proposal rewards actual job creation by true small businesses rather than giving more tax breaks to millionaires, billionaires, who may not create a single job. They have profits, they get a cut in their taxes for their profits, even if they fire people. Does that make any sense? Our bill's common sense measures have had broad bipartisan support. There's no reason that Democrats and Republicans alike should not support them now. The relief in this bill would be a grand slam for our economy as a whole. It puts more people to work, expedites the expansion of successful small business throughout the country, expands businesses to new communities, and keeps money flowing through local economies. For too many business owners, this relief simply cannot wait. So let's get this bill to the President's desk and get our business owners started on the developments that will propel them into the next decade. Once we pass this bill, we must work together to give certainty to American families they won't see a massive tax hike at the end of the year. We should all agree that our small businesses deserve tax cuts in the Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act that will help them hire 1 million workers. We should all agree that no middle-class family should face a tax increase at the end of the year. Let's take care of our areas of agreement, and then we can turn to debate on whether or not our country can afford to give more tax breaks to the wealthiest 2%. Mr. President, I yield the balance of my time. President, I yield the balance of my time and note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.